Hey everybody, this is Mark, and welcome back to Beyond Profit, Global Perspective. Tonight we are going to talk about human resources, and we're going to do that in a couple of ways. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about how human resources change as you go international, right? What are some of the concerns that you might have if you're taking a business overseas and you've got to deal with people, you've got to deal with people who work for you, right? How do you navigate that? How do you handle that? And the second thing we're going to do is look at how might you take those considerations to build a winning business plan, to convince somebody that you really have your act together when it comes to the HR package. So we'll have a look at that after this. I'd like to invite you to please like this, smash that subscribe button, come join us. If there's anything you want to learn about, please let me know in the comments below. If you've got questions for me, I'm happy to engage with you. And hey, I'll even go further. If you would like to come and take classes with me, come over to the University of St. Mary. We have in-person classes, we've got online classes, and you can work with me, you can study with me. I'd be happy to work with you. I think there's so many people out there who have potential in business and politics and so many areas where I could help out. I'd just be happy to be a part of that if you're willing to come work with me. I love this job. I love you guys. This is cool. Let's begin by talking about global human resource management. We're going to do three things. First of all, we're going to briefly review HR and what it does, just have a little short discussion, get the pump primed, so to speak. Then we're going to talk about how it applies to global management, and then we'll talk about how you can incorporate what you've learned into your business plan. Here we go, HR in the office. So let's just have a little talk about this, right? What does HR do? And hey, for fun, what are your general impressions of HR based on popular culture and whatever your personal experience is in the workplace? I understand HR is probably everybody's favorite department. Is anybody an HR concentration person in here? Okay, no. So we can talk trash on HR. It'd be great.
My wife has worked in HR for 10 years or so.
I'm sure she's awesome and an angel and the best HR person ever. Not like any of the other things we've been saying. Tell me about HR, free association.
They're like the rule crackers. They're like the police of the office.
Toby, you're such a killjoy. Yeah, okay. So they have a reputation as being the rule makers, the enforcers, the strict people. So yeah, HR, they may be all black and white, strict with the rules and all that, but somebody's got to follow the law, right? Somebody's got to make sure that we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing so we don't get ourselves in trouble. So yeah, there's a huge legal aspect to HR. What are your hiring practices, right? I mean, in most cases, a manager who knows what the job is will hire somebody, presumably knows what the job is, going to hire somebody to sort of fit that job. And then HR's job is sort of on the back end to sort of make sure, okay, are they going to hit the minimum qualifications? Do they meet the company's expectations? There has got to be a lot of drama in HR. It's like, yeah, the dude in the cubicle that always has to take off his shoes and socks and it smells bad, and what are we going to do with that, right? I mean, there is some drama, and yeah, I suppose probably as an HR person you have to either be willing to deal with it or may actually enjoy that level of drama. I don't know. It is part of the job. Sometimes you have situations in the workplace where there are differences and you've got to figure some way to mitigate or address those differences so that you get the most out of the people that you have there. It's what you have to do. And part of the challenge is like, how do you have difficult conversations with people who are doing things that are disrupting the workplace in some cases? So yeah, it's tough. It's interesting. That's another question too. I mean, is your HR team or your HR person approachable? If someone doesn't give you HR vibes because of their approachability or lack of approachability or whatever, right, is that going to make you more or less likely to come to them? And that's a subjective question, right? It's like you might say, this person seems more casual, so it'd be weird, and I don't know if I feel comfortable with that. Somebody else might look at that person and say, oh, he's laid back, man. It's like I can go talk to him. Isn't that great? Well, that's a really good transition to what we're talking about here, because so much with global management is subjective. So much with culture is subjective. I think I talked to you guys before about being in the Philippines and having people not be able to address me by my first name because I was considered to be an authority figure and I was from the United States, and they couldn't get super casual with that. And so you have to kind of have a sense of what people expect and meet those expectations, or else you're not going to be approachable, right? You're not going to be able to deliver the kinds of things in a way that people expect. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, really, when it comes to some of this HR stuff. Why are human resources important, right? It's essential part of any organization. It's important to understand how employees feel they are being treated, right? So that comes back to some of those subjective questions. It also has to do with whether or not you're going to follow the rules and do what you're supposed to do. And it's especially challenging in an international environment for, just take all of the things we talked about and put it someplace else. And if you're not familiar with that, then those problems multiply. What do you think are some of the biggest HR challenges when it comes to dealing internationally? Some of the things that we think about as major challenges globally reflect a lot of the sorts of things that we think about them in domestic businesses as well. Deployment of the right people to the right place, right? That's sort of similar also to identifying talent, a couple of things that we've mentioned here too. And sometimes you're even thinking not just like the right person in the right seat in the bus, but like the right person in the right part of the world. It's like there's a geographical component that's involved in that as well. The expense of sending people overseas, right? Like, again, it's like, okay, do you get the right people with the right skills? Where do you get them from? And what's the most cost-efficient way to do that? What's the best culturally sensitive way to do that? Right? There's a lot to think about there. Spreading knowledge globally. Cultural differences, you guys mentioned. There are some major cultural differences in terms of accepting of genders, or accepting, as you say, like hierarchical structures. One thing I find interesting is that, so I suspect that we are better than China when it comes to women managers and leaders, as you've suggested. We're kind of behind many other countries in the world in terms of that attitude in the United States. I mean, even places like India have more women CEOs than we do in America. So I don't know, I think we're pretty good at some of that stuff, but I think we've got like a really long way to go compared to some countries anyway. Legal, labor relations, all of those things, definitely some of the biggest challenges in HR. And like I said, and then here's another one, different cultural perceptions of economic systems, right? And we sort of carry, as Americans, we carry our own baggage in terms of the way that we perceive capitalism and how people should be paid and what's fair and how businesses operate sort of within this huge paradigm. And not everybody from every part of the world looks at it that way. Let's look at views of global operations here, right? Just like with entry, global strategy, and marketing, there's situations where you can duplicate things, do the same thing as you do here, or you have to adjust. And there are implications to that. So if you're looking at global operations, there's three major approaches that we do when we're talking about HR. One's ethnocentric, and that is when you use the same HR practices of the parent company in host nations. Now, obviously, there's going to be some differences, right? I mean, you will have to adjust the local laws, and all that, but as much as you can import from whatever you're doing and moving it over to that next place, that would be an ethnocentric approach. So there's that, right? Polycentric is the opposite, right? You're employing local people and adapting the HR practices of the host nation. And then you have this geocentric, where you're focusing on the skills of the employee and adopting HR practices which are the most effective and efficient, irrespective of the nationality. So you're just trying to take the best of whatever you got and move it in there. So my question to you, now that you know what these are, right? Which is easiest, which is cheapest, which is best? Based on what we know about global strategy and what we know about marketing strategy at this point, there are some similarities here. What do you think of the ethnocentric strategy? Is that, what do you think the pros and cons might be to that? Just like what we talked about before, when you're not retooling your product and you're not retooling your marketing strategy and you're standardizing globally, I mean, that's always going to be cheaper just not to change things. You just keep doing the same thing you're doing. That's easier. That's cheaper, right? What kind of challenges can you see perhaps from a polycentric approach? You're adjusting, which makes the people there happy and comfortable, right? But does it match up to the standard that your company is holding for the way employees ought to be treated? And so where in that line is that going to be? Is it going to be like, okay, well, whatever they want is fine, or whatever we want has to be this way? Or is the geocentric approach are we going to meet somewhere in the middle? And yeah, any kind of adaptation is always going to be more expensive, more time intensive, require more research, getting people in there that really know what they're doing, and they're probably going to be local people, but as you say, they might also undermine whatever principles it is that may come from on high, so to speak, and maybe sacrificing that to some extent. You know, you've got HR functions in one country, HR functions in another country, you're dealing with it differently, that's complicated. They could be conflicting about how it is that, okay, well, you treat your people like this, why aren't you treating my people like this, sort of thing. You know, you could end up with that kind of conflict. All sorts of potential problems there. That could also be true in terms of geocentric, I imagine, as well. The next question is, how do you source your managers, right? Where do they come from? So the previous one is like, what's your HR approach? And this question is, where do you get them? And so one approach is to use home country nationals. You take expatriate managers, those are people who are from the home country, and they're citizens of the country where the business is headquarters, and then you move them to wherever it is you need to put them. So what are some of the advantages of using expatriates, right? Definitely good for startup operations. They're familiar with the corporate culture and the operations and the procedures. You don't have to train somebody up. You're just taking people and you're, you know, like you say, it's flagship. You just take it, you move it, and, you know, and they know how to do it, and that's great. That means that they have technical expertise as well. It's nice in that if you can take people and move them over there, it develops them for the future, right? It's like gives them a new experience. And sometimes a stepping stone to sort of higher upper management. It's like, I will trust you with this, see how you do, and if you're doing well, then I will trust you with something else. And it's a good stepping stone for a lot of developing people in their careers. It also helps facilitate coordination and control. Like, you know, we were talking about, like if the standards for operating the business are up here, and you've got people coming from the way it's supposed to be, then they will help that coordination and control. Communication with headquarters is going to be easier. So these are all reasons why you may want to have expatriates. Another approach is to use host country nationals, right? Local managers that are hired by the global business. Why? Well, part of it might be familiarity with the culture. You know, if you're hiring local employees and you've got a local manager, they're going to understand more how things go, and probably it may reduce the amount of conflict. You know, obviously it won't eliminate conflict. I mean, we have conflict in all workplaces all the time, right? But adding that cultural dimension of like, okay, this person's approaching it this way, and why are they doing that? Oh, I guess that's what Americans do, right? You know, that's a different level of conflict that you could possibly avoid if you have a match between people who are local managers and local employees. Language knowledge, clearly less expensive than expatriates, right? You're paying people in their own local currency at whatever the going rate is. If I were 24 years old and somebody said, hey dude, get to go live in Malaysia for a while and get some tuition covered, and man, you get paid like, I don't know what would be acceptable to me, man. I really wouldn't care. I'd be like, yeah, 25, 30, 35 a year, whatever. I'm just like, I'm up for the adventure, man. And if that's where you are in your life, that is great. But that also presumes that you, the 25-year-old, has the expertise to do all the stuff that you need to do, which chances are at age 25, that's not you, right? Chances are it's somebody who's been doing this for 20 years and knows that business forward and backward and knows how to do a startup and, you know, maybe has some international experience someplace else, you know, who knows, right? But you want somebody who really knows what they're doing. And chances are that's not a 25-year-old, right? A 24-year-old. That's probably more like a 44-year-old and somebody who maybe has, you know, family and is in a different place in their life, and they're thinking, oh wow, okay, so now I've got to like move there. Do I move there and just like leave my family behind and see them sometimes? What about travel costs to go visit them? What if I move them out there? Is my wife going to want to move? Where do I put the kids in school, right? You're going to have to pay me whatever it is I'm worth in the United States in order to go over there, right? Why would I take a cut in pay to go do this thing for you in some place I've never been? And some people would look at it as an adventure very positively, and some would be like, oh, geez, what do I have to do to make this work, right? I need a raise. What are you talking about? And if you're paying me in local money and then I move back, it's a pittance. It's not anywhere close to that. So, no, that's the reason why expatriates are more expensive, is you do have to pay them what they're used to, or they're not going to do it, or you're going to have to give them a raise. You got to make it worth their while. They got to get extra special benefits and, you know, sometimes housing and all kinds of things. That's adds up when you're a company trying to get an expatriate to go someplace else. You don't have to take somebody who's from the United States and let's say they demand a certain salary, and then you send them over to Malaysia. Are you going to pay them the same amount? Well, if you do, they're practically a millionaire there with the exchange rate going, which is good for them there, but you know, what happens when they come back to the United States? And then there's this pay discrepancy probably between whoever it is that's your American person versus whoever your local people are. And so, you know, there are pay challenges, right? There's sometimes issues with disparity, and sometimes, like, you know, wouldn't it just be cheaper for me to hire a manager who's there, because there's going to be a lot of capital poured into that person. Like, why would I spend, you know, even on the lowish end for an American worker, $30,000 a year if they're willing to go to another country and do that, when I could probably find a local to do it for $5,000 a year? I don't know what the exchange rate is. One of the advantages sometimes of taking a business and moving it someplace else is to try to be able to take advantage of less expensive labor. So you want to take the same cost labor here and move it there. It doesn't make sense necessarily from a cost standpoint. Also, hiring locals is good public relations. You know, there's a mix in terms of the way different companies approach this, and it may depend on what your business is. You know, maybe a forward-facing business, a retail or a restaurant or something like that. Maybe you want some more locals running that, not just for cost advantages, but because, hey, they could talk to your customers, they understand the culture, you know, they will appreciate that this new local business that came from this other country now is hiring locals. Like I said, it's good PR. So lots of advantages from that standpoint. And of course, some of the disadvantages being some of the other things we already talked about. They may not have the technical expertise yet. They're not those experienced managers that know what they're doing. So, you know, you're paying for this, and it's a lot to pay for it, but you may need that too. And then we get to third country nationals, managers who are citizens of countries other than the country in which the business is headquartered, or the one in which the managers are assigned to work by the business. So why would we use them? They may have expertise for the job that you can't get elsewhere. Maybe you have to go someplace outside the area to get some of the, maybe as a go-between, somebody who will be less expensive and better in this culture than an expatriate that you would bring in from the United States. They can help multinationals develop their global core competencies. You can also subcontract or outsource to take advantage of some of those lower costs and also increase flexibility. I know somebody whose business has just transitioned from having an in-house administrative function to an outsourced one. So, and it's being basically outsourced to India. And it's going to be really interesting too, because there's lots of new AI functions that allow like live translation. So, you overcome some of those language barriers in ways that maybe you couldn't before. But what they are doing actually is sending American managers, administrative managers, over to India then to train those people so that they know what they're doing. They retain an administrative function here, and they may not live over there, but they may be there for a couple of weeks sort of going through how to do this, and maybe somebody's going to go back and work with them again directly, right? Another advantage that we have now are different forms in Zoom or whatever you like, Teams. You can do a lot of stuff through video conferencing that you couldn't do before also, which sometimes isn't a substitute for being in person, but it certainly makes things a lot more flexible than we've ever had before. So a few other considerations in personnel selection. Technical skills and knowledge, right? Does the host country have the education level and the skills necessary to staff your business? So if you're trying to get the people, you're trying to hire locally, you've got to make sure that they actually meet your needs. When Intel moved their operations primarily to Ireland, they went there in part because they had a highly educated workforce, many of whom had advanced IT skills, and they had the training, they had the infrastructure. The government was paying for college education, so lots of people were educated and they could make that work, right? That sort of move could not have worked in just every country in the world. Job experience. Are businesses like yours established so there are experienced workers, right? And we use the movie theater example. I mean, movie theaters are all over the place, and people know how to run movie theaters anyway. Why do you need Americans to come in and run the movie theaters? It's just like, there it is. You get it. And there's also different cultural factors that sometimes affect who you are choosing in terms of personnel. In Mexico and many other countries, it's who you know. Like, it's not just, it isn't always just enough to sort of say, okay, here's my resume, all my qualifications are there. They're going to emphasize a little more like, okay, let's look at those references. And is it somebody that I know? Is it somebody who I think is an expert? Is somebody that I can, like, what is one person's word going to say about who this person is, and what kinds of, how did they work their connections in order to get to me? And that's a little more common there. In China, it's more of a question of how well do you test, right? They've got tests for just about every job in existence over there, and that's been true for centuries. And so there's, it really is much more of a meritocracy in China than it is a lot of places. I mean, the United States, we like to think we're a meritocracy. Whoever works hardest and is smartest, of course, gets the promotion, is always the manager. Isn't that how it really works? We like to think that. But in China, they have like quantitative ways of trying to measure people in terms of that. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but there's much more emphasis on measuring performance than there is, say, in the United States. But here's a question to think about. Like, let's say your employer assigned you to be a manager in another country. Could you be an expatriate? Why or why not? And what would contribute to your success or failure? Well, think about that. Like, even if you haven't spoken out, right, where's your line? And if you were put there, what kinds of things would make it hard for you? But there are limits to what some people are willing to do depending on their personality. So, like, maybe I'm okay with going to Britain because they speak English, but I don't want to go to a non-English speaking country because that's too uncomfortable for me. And heaven forbid I go to India, which is an English speaking country, but oh my gosh, the food and everything, and I don't think I can handle that, right? So, there's certain levels of like, okay, this is okay for me, or I'm totally on an adventure trek and sign me up for Nicaragua. That's really, it's a different kind of a thing. And my inclination is to take more risks in that way, like, and I don't mean like scary risks, but like go into situations that are less familiar. I'm more okay with that than some people. I would be willing to live in a place where they don't speak the same language or where the food is different or whatever. I travel to a lot of places that are like that. But some people are like, oh, well, this is an opportunity for me to move up in my job. I'm going to do this for a year. It's got to be Paris, that kind of thing. And those are also people that you have to deal with as well. Like personally, my latitude is like this, but now I've got kids, so maybe my latitude isn't quite so big. Like, maybe there are countries that I wouldn't necessarily want to bring my kids to for various reasons. Like maybe to visit, but maybe not to live. Right? So we already talked about why you might use expatriates, why other managers might be better in certain situations. What are some of the other challenges? Well, some of the things we talked about, right? Personality. Are you not well adjusted to change? It does take a certain personality to work, and it does have to be somebody who's flexible with change, because depending on the culture, it may be very significant change, it could be not as much, but I would say even if you're going to other countries where they're English-speaking countries and there's a lot in common culturally, there's still lots of change. What's your life like, right? There's issues like family pressure and lack of close friends. Let's say I'm super adventurous and I'm good to go and I bring the family, and you said your husband would grumble for a while, right?
Yeah.
What would happen if you spoke the language and your spouse didn't, right? I have a friend of mine who now works for the Department of Defense, but used to work for the State Department, and they had a posting over in Poland, and he spoke the language and she didn't. She was very lonely for a while, It took her a while to kind of get the hang of what to do and how to handle that. And then it puts pressure on the person, like, hey, I'm having this adventure, it's great for my career, but my wife wants to go home, right? My kids don't like this. And so there's a high degree of expatriate failure because of those other variables that are sometimes involved. So good businesses usually will assess the suitability of the manager's family. They'll do an adaptability screening. So they've got to be adaptable to cultural change. And so this process is sort of to test the family to find out whether or not they can actually survive, right? Are they going to stay there for the period of time that we want them to stay for, or is it going to be after 2 weeks, it's like, I'm done? Because then you've invested a lot of time maybe on language training and cultural training, a lot of stuff, and then they show up there and they're like, this is not what I thought, this is not what I signed up for. So research shows that those who are best able to deal with their new situation have developed coping strategies characterized by sociocultural and psychological adjustments, including feeling comfortable that their work challenges can be met, being able to adjust to their new living conditions, learning how to interact well with host country nationals outside of work, and feeling reasonably happy and being able to enjoy day-to-day activities. If you're working on a plan to expand your business overseas, you do have to reckon with HR. We've kind of been talking around that a little bit. I've delivered a lot of information to you about HR and some of the differences and so on. So my question then is, how does this information affect the HR and personnel plan for your business? That's what we're going to talk about here for a little bit. So what I expect is that you're going to develop a human resources strategy that accounts for local work ethic, cultural values, intrinsic motivations for that culture. It may be hard to identify, but it might help you if you read articles of other companies, what they did when they came into your country, what kind of challenges they may have had. Even if it's not in your industry, you might learn some things about, like, okay, we did this and we shouldn't have done that in our, with our workers or with our customers. So I think it's worth doing that kind of research. And as you're going through and making your plan, these are some things to think about, right? So how do you identify talent? Right? We've talked a little bit about that before, but that's a question. Do they need local or expatriate managers? We talked a lot about that. What's the skill level of the workforce? Is that how much of a match is that going to be for what it is that you're going to do? So the stuff that we talked about before with global operations and HR strategies, right? That's going to hopefully help you put together that part of your plan. What cultural differences will affect your relations with employees, right? Because you have to address some of those cultural questions too. right? We mentioned before questions of motivation, work ethic, business operations, the stuff that you did, the Hofstede insights. That also, I think, is a really valuable thing to return to. Look back at that stuff in your country and figure out, like, is there anything about that that will help you understand how you should deal with employees or how you should deal with customers, right? Uncertainty avoidance, is that going to affect how you deal with people? How do those numbers reveal some aspects of their culture that might illustrate some key differences? Like if your number's way high in the United States and your number's way low and wherever you're going, it might be worth doing a little looking and finding out, like, well, why is that? And is there something in the way I'm dealing with employees that might be a problem if I don't address that? It may not be. It kind of depends on the business, right? If you're not a forward-facing business and you're not dealing with customers, you're just making widgets, whatever, maybe not. But that's the kind of thing you should think about as you are looking at addressing some of that. So some examples of some things that you may want to think about when you're thinking about cultural differences, right? Communication style. Are people more closed or more open, more expressive? How much of themselves do they want to share? Hierarchy and decision making, right? We talked a little bit about hierarchy before, but also, like, how do you want to, how likely are managers willing to delegate? Work-life balance, right? Is it a culture of workaholics, or is it people who really, like, my 40 hours and I'm done and now I want to play, right? And also language choices and differences. So these are things that I would say are good things to ask as you're approaching that HR section. You should also question yourself, right? We talked about misconceptions or stereotypes we Americans sometimes have of other cultures, right? Do you have biases about some of these things that you're asking about? What are your biases, right? So being aware of those will also hopefully help you disconnect your feelings and your opinions and your thoughts from what might be best for the operations and sensitivity toward the people that you have to take care of when you're doing an HR operation. You get to personnel, and it's a little more specific and a little more concrete. Local staffing availability, unemployment rate, right? Show me that you're going to get the workers that you need to do the job. Time zone issues, right? If they've got to coordinate one team in one place of the world with another in the other part of the world, and you're doing a teleconference or a phone call or whatever it is, right? Are you going to have to deal with that? Is that even an issue? What's the time zone differences? Wages, minimum wage, salary requirements, right? They should be competitive and compliant. Labor laws regarding contracts, termination, working hours, overtime, mandated holidays, all things you need to know about. We talked about a lot of that earlier. Data protection regulations, right? In the United States and many Western countries, they now have laws about how much information you can share, right? Making sure you're compliant with that is another important issue. Immigration laws. How easy is it to bring in your own people? Can you get somebody, are you allowed to bring people in? And under what circumstances? What are those rules? What are those laws? And I would recommend that you look at your city, your specific area, as much as you can. Because when you start generalizing things across an entire country, you sometimes don't get a real accurate picture of what you're looking at, right? Just take the United States, for example. How are wages different between Los Angeles and Bentonville, Arkansas? So the same thing is true of Brazil, right? One part of the country, major cities, the pay is probably going to be a lot more than those that are outside the city. So if you're looking at national numbers like the average pay in Brazil is this, you've got to realize that it's baked in the very rich and the very poor and all the people in between. And so understanding what somebody in your industry, in the city, is getting paid is probably going to be more accurate than looking at large numbers that are sort of averages of lots of people, particularly if it's a really big country. So, and with a lot of urban-rural differences and things like that. So, keep that stuff in mind as you're thinking about personnel. You want to determine your actual staffing requirements. How many shifts, how many store managers, how many staff. And this is going to help you put together your financial plan, right? You're not going to know how much your expenses are going to be until you know how many people you need and how much you're going to pay them. So that's sort of on the financial side. That's all I have to say about HR for now. Do you have any questions about that? Don't be afraid to just call somebody or email somebody and ask them, right? Contact the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right? They'd probably have this information and send you a website and say, here you go, here's your information. Or, hey, there's somebody over here that is an expert on Peru. So, they know. Think about those institutions in the United States that are dying for local businesses to go overseas and make some money and so on, right? These government institutions love this stuff, and they have experts. And maybe instead of you Googling for hours and hours, just start by sending somebody a message and seeing if they'll answer your questions. That's the end of our talk on human resources. Hope you got a lot out of that. There's certainly a lot to take into consideration. Just like when we're talking about global business strategy or marketing, right? There are so many things that you can do. You can adjust your approach to whatever that local cultural circumstance is. You can try to standardize certain ways you do things in your home country and try to gain advantages from that. So all sorts of advantages and disadvantages to doing that. The bottom line, though, is that you need to treat your workers well. I mean, look, it's part of my principle is just hopefully being a good human being and representing the university that I work for, that I want people to go out and be good, ethical business people, right? But try to make their life a better place because of the business that you do. And human resources, sometimes it seems boring, sometimes it seems a little dry, sometimes those people are, maybe seems like they take their job too seriously, but we need people like that. And it's important because it's part of what allows us to treat people with the legal rights that they're allowed to have, that they should have, but also hopefully with honor and with respect. So, for Beyond Politics, a Global Perspective, hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you next time.